Welcome back, lovely ladies. If you want to become the woman of your dreams, make sure to hit that subscribe button and like this video. And join our Patreon for even more exclusive content. Now, let's dive into today's story.
Daniel stood in the hallway of the medical school one afternoon in the early 1980s, poring over a thick textbook he had borrowed. The volume detailed various patient care protocols, something he knew he would need in the coming months of his clinical rotations. His black hair, cut neatly above his ears, gave him a tidy look, though there was a certain restless energy about him, as though he were always bracing himself for the next unexpected challenge. At 32, he was older than most of his classmates, having taken some detours in his education, but he had never questioned his commitment to becoming a doctor. He believed in the power of compassion and the importance of skilled medical care, ideals instilled in him by his father, who had worked in public health administration. Late that day, Dr. Elizabeth Harris, one of the school's most respected physicians, approached Daniel with brisk determination in her stride. She was in her mid-50s with salt and pepper hair pulled back in a bun, and she wore the kind of steady, confident expression that immediately commanded respect. She carried a thin folder under her arm, its edges already creased from the many times she had opened and closed it that day. "Daniel," she said, glancing over the rim of her glasses, "I've been meaning to speak with you. Do you have a moment?" "Of course, Dr. Harris," he replied, closing the textbook and tucking it against his side. He followed her to a nearby office that looked out onto the building's courtyard. Faded photographs of the hospital's founding staff hung on the walls. Tall file cabinets were stuffed with patient records and old medical journals. Though it was not Dr. Harris's personal office, it provided a measure of privacy. Once they were settled, Dr. Harris did not waste time on small talk. "You've been doing very well in your clinical assessments," she said. "Always thorough with your patient histories, and your bedside manner is excellent." Her gaze was keen, as though she were trying to gauge his reaction to every word. "But we have a situation," she continued. "As you might have heard, there's a critical shortage of nurses in our local hospitals, especially the women's wards. The shortage is dire." Daniel placed a hand on the back of the chair, trying to piece together why she was telling him this. "I've heard. A few of my classmates mentioned that we've lost a number of staff to bigger cities offering better pay, but I'm not sure I understand how I can help. I'm still finishing my medical degree." Dr. Harris nodded. "Yes, but you have a unique combination of empathy and skill. We need someone in the female-only ward at Crestfield General. The patients there have all sorts of conditions. Some are expecting mothers, some are recovering from surgeries specific to women's health, and they're often quite vulnerable. The hospital's policy is that only female nurses and doctors can work that ward, except in very specific emergency situations." She lowered her voice. "I've been working closely with the hospital's board, and we're at risk of shutting down that ward if we can't find enough qualified staff. An idea was floated that is unconventional, to say the least." Daniel felt a sudden rush of anticipation, though he couldn't imagine what she meant. "I'm listening." She opened the folder on the desk. Inside were typed notes, official letters, and forms filled with hospital logos. She picked up one page. "They've asked if you would be willing to pass yourself off as a female nurse on a temporary basis to help shoulder the workload, and I've offered to supervise. It wouldn't be official in the sense of being a licensed nurse, but you're close enough to finishing medical training that you can manage the responsibilities. The idea is that you'd be introduced as Danielle, your twin sister, so to speak. You would wear standard nurse uniforms, keep your hair styled a certain way, and do your best to blend in. Once we get more qualified nurses, or when the hospital lifts the restrictions, we'll discontinue the arrangement. Your medical knowledge would be invaluable in assisting the ward. They need people who can assess symptoms and make quick decisions." Daniel blinked, trying to wrap his mind around the suggestion. This is definitely not something I ever expected. Are you sure? If I weren't sure, I wouldn't have mentioned it. It's unorthodox, yes. But these are desperate times. The board members are looking for solutions, and this is one of the few that might work quickly. You've shown a willingness to help in any way possible, and you're the right person to do this well. If you decline, I'll understand. But if you agree, the plan would go into effect next week. He shifted in his seat, thinking about the implications. It was a major deception, one that could raise ethical dilemmas. Yet he also understood the urgency. "I need some time to think," he said finally, feeling a mixture of curiosity and unease. Dr. Harris placed a supportive hand on his shoulder. "Take a few days. But we do need an answer soon. I'll be here to guide you through this every step of the way." In the following nights, Daniel weighed the situation carefully. He discussed it briefly with a close friend from medical school, though he could not reveal the full details. His friend cautioned him about the risks, but also acknowledged it was a chance to assist in a critical shortage. After a few sleepless nights, Daniel decided he would do it. He arranged a meeting with Dr. Harris in a small exam room at the campus clinic to confirm his choice. "All right," he said, clearing his throat. "I'm willing to try. It might be the only way to keep that ward running and help those patients." Dr. Harris exhaled with relief. "I know how difficult this must be. Let's get you fitted for some scrubs and a wig, and we'll go through the basics of what you'll need. You'll introduce yourself as Danielle. We'll sort out the ID badges, the uniform. You'll have to practice a different voice, or at least soften it enough to not sound distinctly masculine. But most importantly, you'll rely on your skills to prove you belong there. The staff in the ward is short-handed, so they won't be too suspicious if you show confidence and do the work." 3 days later, Daniel found himself in a staff locker room at Crestfield General, which was quieter than usual at that hour. His reflection in the mirror startled him. He wore a fitted white nurse's uniform with modest shoes. He had shaved his face thoroughly so no stubble would show by midday, and Dr. Harris had arranged for a short brunette wig styled in a practical bob that framed his features. Although he felt self-conscious, the transformation was not as jarring as he had anticipated. He was of average build, and the tailored uniform and wig allowed him to pass well enough at a glance. He spent several minutes practicing expressions and posture. It was a strange exercise, standing differently, changing the pitch of his voice, trying to walk with a subtle grace rather than his usual brisk stride. Finally, Dr. Harris knocked on the door. "How do you feel?" she asked softly as he opened it. "Weird," Daniel admitted, "but also ready to try. Let's see how this goes." They walked together to the administration desk outside the female-only ward. A stern-looking hospital administrator handed him a new name badge that read Danielle Harper. The laminated card felt strangely heavy in his hand, symbolizing all the secrets he was about to carry. He clipped it to his uniform and nodded in thanks, not wanting to draw attention. "Welcome aboard, Danielle," the administrator said without much warmth. Her eyes flicked to Dr. Harris for an instant, then she turned to other matters. Dr. Harris gave Daniel a reassuring look and motioned toward the ward doors. Inside, the atmosphere was busy, despite the shortage of staff. Patients walked slowly up and down the corridors, some pushing IV stands. Others sat in wheelchairs, gazing out the windows that overlooked a small hospital garden. The smell of antiseptics mingled with the faint aroma of cafeteria food. A feeling of both purpose and exhaustion permeated the air. "Danielle?" came a voice from behind. Daniel turned and saw a woman in her late 30s, perhaps early 40s, with warm brown eyes and curly hair pinned under a simple nurse's cap. She wore a cardigan over her uniform, and a ring of keys jingled at her belt. Daniel nodded with a polite smile, remembering to keep his voice softer. "Yes, that's me. She extended a hand in greeting. "I'm Margaret. I've been on this ward for about 15 years, and I'm the acting head nurse when our supervisor is off duty. We're so glad to have the extra help, honestly. Let's get you acquainted with the routines. I hope you'll settle in quickly." There was a genuine warmth in Margaret's manner. Daniel found that comforting given the nerves roiling inside him. "I'm sure I will. Thank you." Margaret led him down a hallway lined with patient rooms. She explained which rooms housed post-operative patients, which were for prenatal care, and which had those with chronic illnesses needing long-term supervision. Along the way, Margaret's gentle yet authoritative manner became more apparent. She knew each patient by name, asked about their families, took time to check if they needed anything. Her compassion was tangible, and Daniel found himself both impressed and moved. They paused near the nurses' station, a cramped alcove stacked high with folders and lab reports. Margaret pointed to a clipboard. "Each shift, we fill out updates for the doctors. But since you're new, let's just get you comfortable with the basic tasks: distributing medication, checking vitals, assisting patients with daily hygiene if needed. If you have questions, come to me. How do you feel about everything?" Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat. "I'm a bit overwhelmed, but also eager to help." "That's good," Margaret said with a small grin. "A little healthy nerves mean you care about the work, and trust me, we need caring people here." Her radio crackled, drawing her attention. "I'll be right back," she told him. Daniel watched her walk away, realizing he would be working closely with someone whose kindness already set him at ease. He wondered whether he could live with the guilt of hiding his true identity from her. But the shortage and the sense of urgency were real, and he reminded himself that it was all to help the patients. He spent the rest of the shift getting a crash course from Margaret on the day-to-day responsibilities. She showed him how to administer medication through IV lines, reminding him to check and double-check the correct dosage. He took vital signs, helped a patient adjust her blanket, and offered a comforting word here and there. It was exhausting, but also oddly fulfilling. He had studied medicine for years, but there was something unique about tending to a patient's practical and immediate needs. That night, as Daniel changed out of his uniform in the locked staff bathroom, he looked at his reflection and hardly recognized the person staring back. Yet he felt a certain satisfaction, having survived the first day without raising suspicion. Dr. Harris was waiting outside with a relieved expression. "I've heard good things from Margaret already," she said. He nodded, letting a small smile show. "She's kind. I think this arrangement will work, at least for a while." Over the next few weeks, Daniel became more proficient at his nursing responsibilities. He found a rhythm in the ward's daily schedule: morning rounds with Margaret, checking on patients, updating charts, administering prescribed medications. He used his medical background to anticipate the doctor's questions before they even came around, which made Margaret trust him more. She'd often say, "Danielle, I don't know how you got so knowledgeable, but I'm glad you're on our side." He would just offer a modest shrug, trying to mask the pride he felt. Beneath the uniform, beneath the wig, there was a man who wanted to be a doctor, who wanted to do good for others. And in a strange way, wearing the nurse's uniform allowed him to witness the hospital from a different perspective than he would have had as a mere medical student on rotations. The closeness with patients, the daily tasks, the constant empathy required, these were lessons he would never have learned in a classroom lecture alone. One afternoon, after a particularly hectic morning assisting in the care of a woman recovering from major surgery, Daniel joined Margaret for a quick lunch in the small staff lounge. She was rubbing her temples, looking drained. "That was quite a flurry," she remarked. "We're understaffed, and the patient load is heavier than usual." Daniel poured a cup of coffee for her. "I can't imagine how you managed before I came on board," he said softly, maintaining the pitched-up tone that had become second nature by now. Margaret sipped her coffee, eyes closing momentarily as she savored the warmth. We barely kept it together, but that's the thing about hospitals. Things need to keep running no matter what. There have been days when I wondered how much more I could give. She glanced at him. But you've made it easier these past weeks. The patients love you. He felt a pleasant stirring in his chest. I'm trying my best. And it shows. She paused, placing her cup on the small table. I realized I've never asked about your background. You seem very knowledgeable, but you're not in the system as far as I can see. Did you train somewhere else before coming here? Daniel felt a spike of anxiety. Well, I studied in different places, he said, deflecting. I moved around a lot, so the records might not be straightforward. I also had some private tutoring. It was a half-truth, but he hoped it was enough. Margaret smiled. I see. Well, I'm glad life brought you here. He breathed easier, grateful that she didn't press further, but he could tell that she was starting to notice small inconsistencies. He resolved to be more careful. Over the following days, they worked side by side, often exchanging stories of their experiences. Margaret told Daniel about her early days as a nurse, the heartbreak of losing patients she had grown attached to, and the sense of purpose that kept her going despite everything. Daniel listened, fascinated by her outlook. She had an unwavering dedication that transcended fatigue and frustration. He found himself respecting her deeply. One evening, Margaret was writing notes when she overheard Daniel speak with a patient about her medication plan in a way that sounded almost like a doctor's approach. She looked up and saw how confidently Daniel explained the rationale behind certain dosages. After the patient thanked him, he turned to see Margaret gazing at him curiously. You explain things like you're more than a nurse, she said softly. I've worked with many doctors, and they typically speak in that tone when they're trying to reassure someone. You do it with such ease. Daniel tried to keep his voice steady. Just an interest I picked up, I guess. Margaret said nothing more, but Daniel could sense her curiosity. He realized it was only a matter of time before she confronted him about his background. Yet day after day, she simply carried on, perhaps deciding that whatever secrets he had, they didn't outweigh the help he was providing. Meanwhile, Dr. Harris would visit the ward occasionally, under the pretense of checking on a few patients. She would pull Daniel aside to ask how he was handling the role. Any issues so far? She asked one afternoon, standing near a supply closet. Not major issues, Daniel replied quietly. Margaret is the best mentor I could ask for, but she's observant. I'm worried she'll figure out I'm not who I say I am. Dr. Harris pursed her lips. We always knew that might happen, but we're buying time. The hospital has posted positions nationwide, so we're hoping real nurses will fill in soon. Once that happens, your cover won't be as critical. He nodded, aware of the ticking clock. He also realized that each day he worked there, he grew more attached to the ward, and especially to Margaret. He admired her dedication, her thoughtful approach to patient care, and her steady presence. Though he tried to remind himself it was all a temporary arrangement, he found it increasingly difficult to ignore how much he looked forward to seeing her each shift. One night, well after visiting hours ended, Daniel was charting some notes when a sudden commotion broke out near the end of the corridor. A patient who had undergone surgery earlier that week was in distress, her vital signs dropping, her breathing labored. The nurse on duty cried out for help, and Daniel sprinted into the room. He quickly assessed that the woman might be experiencing internal bleeding. His medical training kicked in, and he began giving rapid instructions. Prepare an IV line for blood transfusion, he said, glancing at the half-dazed nurse who stood by in shock. We need to alert the on-call surgeon right away. The nurse stared at him, confused by his decisive manner, but Margaret rushed in moments later, catching on immediately. She called the operator to page the surgeon while Daniel applied the steps he knew from emergency protocols. The patient's blood pressure was dangerously low, and Daniel checked for signs of hemorrhaging. By the time the surgeon arrived, the patient had stabilized enough for safe transport to the operating room. Daniel had effectively taken charge, using medical knowledge beyond what most nurses would ordinarily demonstrate. The crisis ended as the patient was rushed away, leaving Daniel, Margaret, and the other staff standing in the now quiet hallway, still breathless from the ordeal. Margaret looked at Daniel with a flood of emotions in her eyes. "Danielle, that was incredible. You knew exactly what to do, like you'd handled this kind of situation before many times. How—" Daniel felt his heart pound. "I just remembered some advanced coursework," he managed to say. I picked up a few things." Margaret wanted to question him more, but the swirl of adrenaline, relief, and exhaustion overtook them both. She simply pressed her hand to his shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered. After that incident, whispers spread among the nursing staff. Many were grateful for Danielle's quick thinking, but a few were puzzled. In the break room, Daniel overheard one nurse say quietly to another, "I've never seen someone so new handle a crisis like that." Yet no one challenged him outright because he had saved a life, and in the end, that mattered more than the strangeness of his expertise. Margaret grew increasingly curious. "Danielle," she said one afternoon, pulling him aside in an empty patient room, "will you be honest with me about something? I'm not accusing you of anything wrong, but I can't shake the feeling there's more to your background." He took a moment to gather his thoughts, scanning her face, noting her genuine concern. "I promise I'm here because they desperately needed staff," he said in a measured tone. "I have some medical training from other places." It wasn't a complete lie, but it was far from the entire truth. Margaret studied him. "I believe you. You've been a godsend, especially with the shortage. I won't pry, but if you ever need to talk, I'm here." A wave of guilt coursed through him. He gave her a quick nod and hurried back to his work, not knowing how else to respond. Despite the tension that simmered whenever his identity came into question, Daniel found deep satisfaction in his role. He was learning the nuances of bedside care in a way that few medical students ever would. He was forging relationships with patients, encouraging them through their treatments, consoling them in their moments of pain or uncertainty. And Margaret, with her steady warmth, became the person he confided in most about daily challenges, without ever revealing his most guarded secret. One weekend, he learned that Margaret had volunteered to run a small health seminar at the hospital's community wing, aimed at educating local women about basic prenatal and postpartum care. Daniel offered to help. The seminar turned out to be a modest gathering of about 20 attendees. Margaret spoke confidently, demonstrating simple stretches, discussing nutrition, and showing how to swaddle a newborn using a cloth doll. Daniel handed out pamphlets, helped coordinate the sign-in sheets, and occasionally chimed in with a gentle suggestion. Each time Margaret caught his eye, she gave him a grateful smile. Afterward, as they packed up the supplies in a small conference room, Margaret sighed. "I wish the hospital had more resources for community outreach. These women often don't get enough guidance. We do what we can, but it's never enough." "It's still something," Daniel offered, leaning against a table. "They'll remember what they learned today." She nodded. "That's true. Sometimes the smallest effort can make a big difference." They ended up chatting for almost an hour after the last attendee left, discussing the complexities of health education, the challenges facing the hospital, and the bureaucratic obstacles that seemed never-ending. Margaret found herself opening up about her own life, the long hours, the personal sacrifices, how she had once considered leaving the nursing profession but couldn't bear the thought of leaving patients without adequate care. Daniel listened intently, drawn to her honesty. He noticed the faint lines around her eyes, the subtle signs of many nights spent worrying about her work. He felt a connection that went beyond professional camaraderie. Yet he knew he was tangled in a deception that could shatter whatever trust she had in him. As the weeks turned into months, rumors circulated that the hospital was getting close to hiring a few more certified nurses. Administration was finally responding to the pleas of overworked staff. Dr. Harris hinted that once the new hires were trained, Daniel's role as Danielle could end. But by then, he was deeply entrenched in the ward, well-liked by his co-workers, appreciated by the patients. And more complicated was how close he had become to Margaret. She often asked him to help with challenging patients, trusting his input as if he were more than just a colleague. On a crisp autumn day, Margaret motioned for Daniel to follow her into an unoccupied patient room. The light outside had turned golden as the sun lowered. They had just finished their shift, and the ward's next team of nurses was taking over. Margaret closed the door and took a deep breath. "I need to talk to you about something important. I want to emphasize that I'm not trying to cause trouble or make accusations." Daniel felt his heart thud. He shut the door completely behind them. "All right, what's on your mind?" Margaret shifted, her voice quiet. "You've been an incredible help here. You've shown knowledge and skills that go beyond anything I've seen in a new nurse. I've heard small bits of gossip, but I never listen to rumors too much. I prefer facts. So I'd like to ask you directly, are you actually a trained doctor, or close to it?" Daniel's pulse quickened. He considered lying outright, but something in Margaret's gentle gaze made him pause. "Margaret, you have to understand. I can't explain everything right now, but you're not wrong." She nodded slowly, as if she'd suspected as much. "I knew it. The way you handled that emergency, the knowledge you exhibit. It's clear you have medical training that goes beyond typical nursing duties." She took another breath, then continued. "But there's something else, isn't there? You're different in a way I can't put into words. I don't know how to ask this politely, but I want to make sure you know that if you're hiding something important, you don't have to be afraid of my judgment. You've more than proven you're here for the right reasons." Daniel clenched and unclenched his hands. This was the moment he had feared, and in some odd way, the moment he had hoped for. "Margaret, I wish I could just tell you everything, but there are other people involved, and it's complicated. I promise I'm not doing this to harm anyone. It's about helping the ward." She studied his face, her expression flickering with understanding. "If it means keeping this place running, I trust you. All I ask is that you be honest with me as soon as you can. And if there's anything I can do to help, just let me know." His eyes stung. He was overwhelmed by how accepting she was, even without a full explanation. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice wavering. Soon after, the hospital announced that several new nurses would be arriving in the coming weeks. The plan was to have them shadow the current staff and gradually take over shifts. Dr. Harris and Daniel realized that the time for Daniel's disguised role was drawing to a close. The official story would be that Danielle had decided to relocate, or that she was simply a temporary hire. As the date for the new nurse's arrival grew closer, Daniel felt a knot in his chest. The deception had weighed on him from the beginning, but now he had to face the prospect of leaving the ward and Margaret. And there was the matter of how to come clean. He owed Margaret an explanation. He rehearsed what he might say, how he might explain the reasons behind the disguise. Still, he found it difficult to gather the courage. One late evening, after a long shift, Margaret asked him to meet her in a secluded corner of the hospital cafeteria, which was nearly empty. They sat across from each other at a small table under buzzing fluorescent lights. The hush of the room only heightened the tension. "They've been training the new nurses this week," she began, her voice subdued. It looks like we might have enough staff to manage now. Daniel nodded, staring into his untouched cup of tea. That's what I've heard. She leaned forward, folding her hands. I wanted to see you before you vanish, because that's what it feels like is going to happen. One day you'll just be gone, and I'll be left with questions. I can't let that happen. Not after everything we've been through on this ward. He swallowed hard. Margaret, you deserve the truth. The thing is, I'm actually a medical student. My real name is Daniel. Dr. Harris convinced me to take on this role because of the hospital's policy for the female-only ward and the severe shortage. It was a ruse to keep the place functioning. I'm sorry. She listened with a calm intensity, her eyes never leaving his face. That's what I suspected. I just didn't realize the extent. I don't know what I expected you to say, but, well, that explains a lot. He felt his cheeks burn. It started as a desperate measure, and I didn't think I'd end up caring so much. About the patients. About you. Margaret took a moment to process. You've been working here tirelessly, showing genuine concern for everyone. I can't say I'm thrilled about the deception, but I see why it was done. And if I'm honest, the difference you made was enormous. She paused, her tone softening. So you'll be leaving soon then? Daniel nodded. Yes, once the new nurses settle in. Then I'm expected to go back and finish my final requirements as a med student. I'll be rotating through different departments, and eventually I'll start residency somewhere else. Margaret's expression was a mix of relief, sadness, and something else he couldn't quite read. Well, I guess we should be grateful you were here while it mattered. Daniel stared at the tabletop. I never intended for things to go this way. I didn't expect to form close bonds here, but working under your guidance, I've learned so much. About patient care, about empathy. I don't know if I can just walk away like nothing happened. She reached across the table, resting her hand gently on his. You don't have to pretend it didn't happen. You did something unconventional, but you did it for the right reasons. Maybe that's what matters most. Her voice quavered. But I do wish we had more time. A silence settled between them, thick with unspoken feelings. Finally, Margaret pulled her hand away. Whatever path you take, I hope you stay true to what I've seen in you, the caring side that puts patients first. He nodded, fighting a wave of emotion. I promise. A week later, the new nurses had mostly integrated into the ward. Dr. Harris called Daniel into an empty exam room. She had a small smile of gratitude, but her posture was tense. This is it, she said. We can't keep up the charade much longer. The board is satisfied with the new hires. They're ready to let you go back to your real name. Daniel let out a slow breath. All right. When do I leave? Tonight is your last shift. The official story will be that Danielle had a short-term contract and is now off to another facility. Tomorrow you can arrive as yourself if you'd like, and begin finalizing your remaining medical school requirements. His thoughts drifted to Margaret, to the patients he had grown fond of, to the way he felt every time he put on the nurse's uniform and realized he was part of a vital team. Understood, he said, trying to keep his composure. That night, he moved through the ward with a strange heaviness in his chest. He checked on each patient with the care he always showed, exchanged polite words with the staff, and did his best to avoid emotional farewells. He slipped away around midnight, depositing his nurse's uniform in a bag. Dr. Harris drove him home, neither of them speaking much. She offered some words of reassurance. You did well, Daniel. You really did. But he barely heard them over the ache in his heart. The next morning, Daniel arrived at Crestfield General wearing a simple button-down shirt and slacks. He had styled his black hair in its usual neat cut, his face clean-shaven without the worry of concealing stubble. He felt both relieved and strangely out of place. People who had known Danielle walked by him, not giving him a second glance. It was as though he were invisible in plain clothes. Eventually, he found Margaret near the nurse's station. She was updating a patient chart. She glanced up at him and froze. Their eyes locked, and a faint smile crossed her face. He walked over, trying to choose his words carefully. "Hi, Margaret. I'm Daniel," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I'm sorry if this is awkward." She took a moment to look him up and down, registering his appearance without the disguise. Then she closed the file and set it aside. "Hello, Daniel," she answered warmly. "It's good to finally meet you this way." They stepped aside to a quiet corner of the hallway. Daniel observed how different it was to stand next to her without worrying about posture or voice. "I hope you're not angry," he murmured. She shook her head. "No, I'm not angry. It's been a whirlwind, but I can't deny that you helped save this ward when we were at a breaking point. That means a lot." He felt a knot loosen inside him. "I'm going to be around the hospital in various departments for the next few months, finishing up my medical rotations. I'd like to keep in touch if that's okay." Margaret paused, a flicker of hesitation in her eyes, then she nodded. "I'd like that too." In the weeks that followed, Daniel threw himself into his final rotations, gaining experience in emergency medicine, pediatrics, and general surgery. Occasionally, he stopped by the female ward to see how things were going, careful not to intrude. Some of the new nurses recognized him as the medical student, but had no idea he was once the colleague named Danielle. He would exchange quick smiles with Margaret, who was usually too busy to chat. Yet each time their eyes met, it reminded him of the unusual bond forged between them. One evening, after a particularly demanding shift in the emergency department, he walked through the hospital garden seeking a moment of calm. To his surprise, he saw Margaret sitting on a bench, gazing at the autumn leaves that had begun to fall. She was off duty, still in her uniform, but looking pensive. Daniel approached quietly, hands in his pockets. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. She shook her head, patting the space beside her. "I come out here when I need a moment to think. You caught me in the middle of some heavy thoughts." Daniel settled on the bench, noticing the crisp, cool air. "Are things on the ward going okay?" "Better than before," she replied. "We have enough staff now, thanks to the new hires. But it's strange not having you there, especially when I remember how vital you were during that crisis. Sometimes I still look around expecting to see you." He lowered his gaze. "I miss it too. The time I spent on that ward changed the way I view patient care. It taught me more than I ever learned in lectures." Margaret sighed softly. "I always appreciated the care you showed. You were so attentive to their needs, and you adapted quickly. Not many people can do that." They let the hush of the garden settle for a moment, absorbing the hush of the evening. Then Daniel spoke in a quiet tone. "I'm not sure where I'll do my residency yet, but it might be at a different hospital, possibly another state. If that happens, Margaret placed a hand on his arm. "Let's not dwell on that just yet. Right now, you're here, and you're finishing your training. The future, well, we'll figure it out." He nodded, feeling warmth flood through him at her gentle touch. "I'd like to see you outside the hospital sometime. Maybe we could get coffee or something." She studied his expression for a long moment, her voice soft. "I'd like that." It was a simple agreement, but it held the promise of something more real, unbound by the secrets that had defined their initial connection. In the days that followed, Daniel and Margaret began seeing each other after their shifts ended, sharing quiet cups of coffee or strolling through the neighborhood near the hospital. They didn't label their relationship, it was complicated enough, but both realized they had formed a rare understanding of each other's dedication and compassion. As months slipped by, Daniel completed his rotations. He managed to impress senior physicians with his clinical acumen. One day he was offered a residency position at a respected hospital, though it meant relocating a couple of hours away. He accepted, recognizing it was a significant step in his career, but it also meant he had to confront the reality of leaving Margaret behind in a practical sense. On his final week at Crestfield, he wrapped up loose ends in different departments. He spent his last day on the female ward, no longer disguised, simply observing and occasionally assisting if the staff needed an extra pair of hands. The patients who had been there for a long time recognized him vaguely as the medical student who had come through. Only Margaret looked at him with a memory that ran deeper. At the end of the shift, they found a moment to speak in a quiet side hallway near a supply cart. She looked at him, a mixture of pride and longing. "It'll be strange not seeing you in these halls anymore. I'll miss your presence, Daniel." He tried to maintain a steady voice. "I'll miss you too. You've been a mentor, a friend, and so much more. I hope you know how much I admire you." Her eyes glistened. "I learned as much from you as you did from me, maybe more." They stood there for a moment, the unspoken realities of distance and new beginnings settling around them. Finally, Margaret forced a smile. "We'll stay in touch, right? Letters, phone calls, maybe visits if you can manage." Daniel nodded. "Absolutely. I won't vanish this time, not unless you tell me to leave you alone." She pulled him into a quick, warm hug, just a moment, but enough to convey a depth of feeling that words could not. When she stepped back, her eyes were misty. "Good luck with residency. They're lucky to have you." With a gentle smile, he left the ward for what might be the last time in that capacity. As he walked down the hospital corridor, memories flooded him. The first day in that ill-fitting wig, the confusion and anxiety, Margaret's guiding presence, the long nights of caring for patients who needed him. It had been a surreal chapter in his life, one marked by disguises and secrets, but also by empathy and genuine caring that transcended appearances. Not long afterward, Daniel started his residency, diving into the long hours and rigorous schedule that came with it. He excelled in handling patient care, often recalling the techniques he picked up during his time as Danielle. He wrote to Margaret when he could, updating her on his progress, asking about the ward's status. She responded with letters that detailed the day-to-day challenges and triumphs, occasionally hinting at how much she wished they could talk in person more often. Months turned into a year, and Daniel arranged a weekend trip back to the city where Crestfield General was located. He showed up at Margaret's apartment with a small bouquet of flowers, his heart pounding as he knocked on the door. When she opened it, the immediate warmth of her smile told him that the bond they'd forged had not dimmed. They sat in her cozy living room, talking about everything and nothing. Though life had taken them on different paths, their connection remained. Eventually, the conversation turned toward the hospital. Margaret told him that the ward was running smoothly now. "They finally have enough staff so that nobody is working double or triple shifts on a regular basis," she said. "The patients are in good hands." Daniel set down his cup of tea. "I'm so relieved. Sometimes I worry about that place, remembering how desperate it was when I first arrived." She gave him a thoughtful look. "The staff still tells stories about the mystery nurse who came and disappeared so suddenly. Of course, I keep your secret, but I like to think they'd appreciate the truth if they ever found out." He managed a small laugh. "Well, it was an unusual situation, one I never saw coming, but I don't regret it. It shaped me as a caregiver." Margaret reached for his hand, her expression tender. "You're a different person than when you first stepped onto that ward. You've seen a side of nursing most doctors don't get to see, and I'm glad I got to witness that growth firsthand." He squeezed her hand lightly. If there's anything I learned from the entire ordeal, it's that real compassion takes many forms. Sometimes you have to break expectations to serve those who need it most. As the evening wore on, they found themselves talking about possible futures. Margaret hinted that she might transfer to a different department someday, possibly for career advancement. Daniel mentioned that after his residency, he could see himself returning to practice near Crestfield, or maybe somewhere close enough that they could see each other regularly. Neither made any concrete promises. They both understood that life in medicine was unpredictable, but the connection between them felt solid and enduring. In the days that followed, Daniel returned to his residency, more determined than ever to be the kind of physician who truly listens to his patients, who sees them as humans rather than conditions. He carried with him the memory of scrubbing in for routine duties as a disguised nurse, the humility of rolling up his sleeves to handle small tasks that often go unnoticed by busy doctors. He carried Margaret's unwavering dedication in his heart as a beacon, reminding him that the essence of healthcare is compassion above all. Though the official story would remain that Danielle left Crestfield for personal reasons, Daniel and Margaret both knew the truth was far more complicated and far more profound. It was not a simple costume or a convenient cover. It had become a testament to how far people would go to provide care in a time of crisis, and how unexpectedly bonds could form when working closely under difficult circumstances. Years later, as Daniel sat in his new office at a different hospital, a small letter arrived. It was from Margaret, detailing an upcoming patient care conference she planned to attend in his city. She ended the letter simply by writing, "Hope to see you there." He smiled at the note, thinking back to his days as Danielle, remembering the lessons learned and the relationships forged. Then he placed the letter carefully in a drawer, silently grateful that a desperate, unconventional act had led him to discover the true depth of empathy and the unwavering dedication of someone like Margaret. And he was quietly determined never to lose that sense of purpose no matter what uniform he wore.
Did you like the story? Hit that like button and tell me what you thought in the comments. Do you want to hear more stories? Subscribe and hit the bell. For exclusive content and early access, check out our Patreon. You can find the link in the description, or you can watch any of the videos shown on my right. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.